Okay, so let's move to Trump then. I think what you said there is an interesting segue to Trump. So there seems to be this feeling that the white supremacists are back. They're back in business. And
White boys are back.
And it's because of Trump. So I saw this. Did you see this video of this guy, Richard Spencer, who's the alt-right guy?
The guy got punched.
He got punched. I tweeted out that this guy has obviously bad ideas. I've had family members on both sides of my family killed in the Holocaust, so I am not a Nazi sympathizer in any way. But I have to defend his right to free speech without being punched, because that's the whole point. You can't just defend it when it's easy. You got to defend it when you don't want to, and that's. But I saw a lot of people on the left, a lot of famous people, a lot of people with a lot of influence saying, no, it's okay to punch Nazis, which if you just follow their logic through, well, he could have killed him because you could accidentally kill somebody. And then if it's okay to punch a random person because of their beliefs, can we blow up his car? Can we bomb his house? I mean, this is a horrifically slippery slope, right?
Of course it is. Is it okay for me to burn up a building because I'm unhappy because of the way the police treat me? Are riots perfectly okay? Would it be okay if somebody walked up to John Lewis and punched him because they feel that John Lewis should have attended the Donald Trump inaugural? Where do we go with this? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And believe me, it would have been a huge story if there had been somebody like John Lewis who had been punched, as opposed to this Spencer guy that the media doesn't care about and feels is loathsome. I understand that, but I would have thought there would have been a little more coverage of it, but there wasn't very much.
Yeah, so I know a certain amount of people are going to watch this and go, wait a minute. Here's a black guy and a Jew somehow defending a Nazi's right to free speech. He wants to, I'm pretty sure he'd want to kick both of us out of the country or something close to that. But it's tough to have principles, right? I mean, isn't that the crux of what you're saying? Basically, the through line of all of this is you got to have some principles.
Wasn't it Voltaire who said, I disagree with what you said, but I would defend to my death your right to say it? I mean, we're talking about principles here.
Yeah.
Free speech.
So
and by the way, it's not unlawful to hate somebody. You can hate somebody. As you pointed out earlier, you can't put your hand on that person, but you have every right to dislike somebody for whatever reason you want.
Yeah. So I sense that a lot of people think, though, that white supremacy is back, that they feel that there was a link to Trump somehow. I don't really see that link, but there was a link that somehow he unearthed this, and now Pepe the Frog and Harambe the monkey and the white supremacists, they've been unearthed, and now they feel it's okay. So their only response is to hit back. I would argue, which I think you would argue, which is you beat them with better ideas. Let this idiot talk. And guess what? He's going to show what a fraudulent bigot he actually is.
Right.
But do you think there's any resurgence of actual white supremacy? I mean, is that a real issue?
I'm not seeing it. Donald Trump got a higher percentage of the black vote than Mitt Romney did, than John McCain did. He got a higher percentage of the Hispanic vote than Mitt Romney did. He got a smaller percentage of the white vote than his predecessor, than the Republican who ran before him. So I'm not seeing it. I am seeing a resurgence in the assertion that white supremacy is back, but I'm not seeing it. Look, one of Donald Trump's surrogates was Dr. Ben Carson. Is Dr. Ben Carson somebody that's going to cozy up to somebody who's a white supremacist? One of my friends, Stephen Miller, is the young speechwriter who wrote Donald Trump's inaugural speech and wrote his RNC speech. He's about 30, in his early 30s. I've known him since he was a teenager. He is not somebody who's going to work for a white supremacist. He happens to be a Jew.
Yeah.
So Donald Trump's a wrong vehicle to peg that on. And John Lewis said that he was not going to attend his inauguration. The first time in all of his years being in Congress, he's not going to attend the presidential inauguration. False. He did not attend George W. Bush's inauguration.
Yeah.
Now, was George W. Bush a Nazi? Was he a fascist? Was he a racist? What was your argument, Mr. Lewis, if he were here, I'd ask him, for not attending George W. Bush's inauguration? I understand Donald Trump's, but explain George W. Bush's to me.
Right. So is that the crazy position that a lot of people have painted themselves into now? They've screamed and ranted and raved that Trump and this whole movement is vile and racist and all this stuff, where now if he does any good, they're going to have to lash out in crazy ways, because you can't have a guy that you've been calling Hitler for a year, you can't suddenly admit that he's doing some good stuff, right? So they've put themselves in a really tight intellectual box here.
I think they have. And again, Donald Trump is a bad vehicle to do that with, because if you look at some of his points of view, they're quite populist and quite left-wing. He and Bernie Sanders were completing each other's sentences on free trade.
Yeah.
And when Donald Trump had that interview with 60 Minutes and he was asked about same-sex marriage, he said it was settled law. He could have said the same thing he said about abortion, which was, I'm going to put on a justice who ultimately would turn over Roe v. Wade. He didn't say that, but that's what he wants to happen. But he could have said that regarding gay marriage, because gay marriage is less settled law than abortion. Abortion has been on the books since 1973. The gay marriage decision just now came down.
Oh, so your argument is that he's actually more for gay marriage than he is for abortion?
Yes.
Yeah.
On gay marriage, he said to Steve Croft, that issue's been settled. Really? He could have said, I'm going to put on justices that will look at the Constitution and will have all these issues go back to the states, like abortion. But he didn't. He said same-sex marriage is settled law, which was his way, in my opinion, of signaling to all of the people in the country, especially his critics, that I am okay with same-sex marriage. And as I mentioned, on free trade, he and Bernie Sanders were identical. And on infrastructure, he wants $1 trillion infrastructure investment. Chuck Schumer just now said that he's okay with that.
Yeah.
When you have Chuck Schumer smiling, it seems to me you ought to be worried. But the point is, these are left-wing kinds of things.
Yeah.
And they felt that Obama's stimulus was too small, and this is bigger than that. So they're giddy over all of that. So why Donald Trump is engendering all of this hostility when he has so many centrist, if not left-wing points of view, is beyond me.
Well, I think it has to do with just the way he speaks. I think, my concern about him from day one, as I've said 1,000 times on the show, I don't know what his moral center is. But I don't know that you know what a lot of these guys' moral center is. At the end of the day, a lot of them speak a lot cleaner, so you think you know it, and then you don't know it. You'd probably argue that about Obama. But for Trump, I don't know what it is. That being said, I think the answer to your question is, I think the left no longer has the ability to understand the difference between words and actions. So they see his gruff language and some poorly phrased things, and that he speaks not that well, and then they think that translates into action, when in fact he actually did a lot of things that brought them more center.
I think it goes back to what we said earlier, and it's just a lack of critical thinking. I think when there's an R at the end of your name, all of a sudden there are certain sets of views that people assume you have, and they go after those views. I look at his moral center. I look at Donald Trump's family. These kids adore him. He's had 3 different marriages. It's complicated to put all that stuff together. 3 different marriages, children from all 3 of the marriages, and they all get along and they all worship their father. How bad a guy can he be?
It's funny, I had Donald Trump Jr. on my SiriusXM show talking about how he was for gay marriage. This is about a little bit before it got passed, so about, let's say, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, talking about how he personally was for gay marriage even though his dad wasn't, and that his dad said, you go out and tell people whatever you want. So I thought that's actually a nice marker of sort of what a father should be. Do you fear his authoritarian side at all? Because as you said, small L libertarian, so you want the government to scale back. I sense he is going, he's going to lower taxes, and they're already doing some stuff with regulations that you're probably for and that kind of stuff. But do you sense there could be an authoritarian side, even controlling what businesses can do overseas and that kind of stuff, that you may not like?
There are things he said that I don't like. I don't know that I would label them authoritarian. I would label them as stupid. For example, saying I'm going to put on a 30 or 40% tariff on goods that come in from this country if you've left the country and started a factory. All you're doing is discriminating against cheap prices and hurting American consumers. I, as a business person, have an obligation to maximize shareholder return. And if my biggest cost is labor, and I can go somewhere else and build my widgets for less money, I have an obligation to do that. And if I don't do that, my competitor will. And for a business person like Donald Trump to tell another business person, I'm going to punish you for seeking profits, to me is outrageous. I understand and support his idea that a lot of the reason people go overseas is because we have onerous regulations and high corporate tax. But once you lower the regulations and lower the corporate taxation, and I as a CEO have made a calculation that I can make more money by putting my factory in a third world country, how dare you tax me for doing that? What gives you the right to do that?
Right, so you would basically argue that if he lowered the corporate tax rates, did everything he could to unregulate business here, you wouldn't need that tax on the overseas stuff, right? Because it would be humming and purring nicely here.
Well, you wouldn't need to leave the country to
Yeah.
set up a factory because you would stay here. What we have right now are all these environmental rules and regulations designed to fight climate change. We have a very high corporate tax rate, the highest in the industrialized world. You deal with those kinds of things, and you'll take away the incentive that some CEOs have to move outside the country. But assuming you take all those away, and you lower the regulatory burdens that CEOs have to deal with, and they still want to put a factory somewhere, you have absolutely no right to stop them from doing that.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Do you think it's hilarious how we look at certain companies that do the exact same things as other companies? Some are okay, some aren't. So, for example, Trump made his ties in Mexico, which I kept saying all along, this isn't something you're getting him on. He's proving the point. He's proving the point that it's cheaper to do there. Change the regulations and then he wouldn't have to. At the same time, a company, and Trump was mocked relentlessly for doing that, right? At the same time, Apple designs their stuff in Cupertino, as they say, and it's all made in China, and they hide all kinds of stuff tax-wise, but we're all walking around with iPhones. How come some companies are able to, that's just the cool factor of Apple?
I think so, and I think Al Gore was on the board of directors of Apple at one point, if he isn't now, and here they are manufacturing stuff in China. Yeah, some companies have better PR than other companies.
He also sold Current TV to Al Jazeera, which is owned by Qatar, one of the biggest exporters of oil in the world, but, you know.
But
let's not.
Well, we digress.
Let's not dwell on that.
That's right.
Okay, let's move over to fake news because this is so tied into what's happening with Trump. The outrage machine and then the fake news machine, all of this. You've been all over this. I am just apoplectic. I'm apoplectic about what's going on with this because I see the mainstream media crumbling. I see online media growing, but I see risks in that too because anybody can put on a tie and pretend they're somebody and get a desk, and that's, it is what it is. How bad is this scourge of fake news?
I think we've always had really bad fake news. It just got passed off as CBS, NBC, or ABC. There have been lots of stories, in my opinion, that have been fake news stories. One of them was when Obama was pushing Obamacare. He said over and over again that his mother, who was suffering from cancer, as she lay dying in her hospital bed in Hawaii, had to fight with her insurance carriers to pay for her medical bills and her hospital bills. Turns out it is not true. He said it over and over and over again. A book came out by a woman named Janie Scott, who used to work with the New York Times, therefore it must be a good book. And she said that those bills were promptly paid. The only quarrel was that Obama's mom had taken out a policy so that if she got sick, she would be entitled to money. Mm-hmm. And the law is that if you have been diagnosed and you try to take a policy out like that, we can challenge it, and that's what they challenged. But regarding her medical bills, hospital bills, they were paid promptly. But he said it over and over and over again, and it helped to drive the narrative that if my mother got jacked over and she has a PhD and has a son from Harvard with a law degree, imagine what these insurance carriers will do to you. It turns out completely not true. Another fake news, I think I said earlier, when Obama said during his many press conferences, I am most proud of the fact that I rescued the economy. Really? TARP was done by George W. Bush. The bailouts were done by George W. Bush. And many of the things that Obama has done, including stimulus, actually hurt the recovery, didn't help it. Yet he says this over and over again with a straight face. And the failure of the media not to ask challenging questions when he raises that, to me, is fake news.
So that's the issue. So not to split hairs there, but that's the issue, that we've had basically a lapdog media. So there's the idea, I think when the left talks about fake news, they're talking about these right-wing sites that are just making up things. And
right.
they push a lot of that on Breitbart, and we can talk about that if you want.
Mm-hmm.
But that's different than what you're talking about, which is just a media that just simply got cozy. They got cozy with the people in power, so they just stopped doing their job. You're calling that fake news.
Absolutely.
But these are two separate types of fake news.
Absolutely.
For sure.
I talked earlier about Obama pulling completely out of Iraq over the objection of his team. He also then said, well, the reason I did that is because George W. Bush had negotiated an agreement that required me to leave at the time I did. Completely not true. George W. Bush did negotiate an agreement, but he fully expected his successor to negotiate a stay-behind force. And again, Obama has said this over and over again, and the media hasn't said anything about that. That, to me, is fake news.
Right. So I remember when that happened, and I remember thinking when Obama said it, yes, they had set the date, but obviously Obama had plenty of political capital at the time. If he had wanted to stay, he could have stayed. So that's right. This is it's just a conflation of poor media practices. And we saw a lot of this with Hillary, right?
Not just poor media practices.
Because I expect politicians
the willingness
to lie.
look,
That's my
the willingness
point.
the willingness to look the other way because it's a guy that you're pulling for.
Yeah.
When Obama came into office, he reneged on a deal that George W. Bush had negotiated. He negotiated a deal with Poland and with the Czech Republic for them to get missile defense. Russia didn't like it. Obama thought that he could curry favor with Russia by reneging on the deal, and he did. The failure of the media to bring this up and to bring up him saying, him pushing the reset button, and him saying to Medvedev, when I get reelected, I'll have more flexibility. The failure of the media to bring this up when they're hitting Donald Trump for being too cozy with Putin is another example of fake news.
Yeah, so that to me is the monster that we've created. They did nothing for so long. Now, because they don't like Trump, they're trying to be professional suddenly, which I want them to.
Right.
I want them to do true investigative journalism. I want them to fight the power, but they seem almost ridiculous doing it now because they're watching tweets and getting outraged before we can.
Right. I just wrote a column about all of this, and what I've said is that the media has rediscovered their mission now that the Republican is back in the White House.
Yeah.
But before that, in my opinion, they didn't do their jobs.
Yeah. Is it almost too late for them? Have they? Because I think they've lost so much cred that even now as they scurry to get their cred back. I mean, for example, yesterday or the day before, I watched the second Sean Spicer press conference, not the quick one where he was bickering about...
The first official
I watched the first official one, right? I think it was Monday.
Right.
And I watched the entire thing. I was doing cardio.
So did
That's
I,
the only way I can watch it, right?
Right.
I have to be moving.
Right.
You got to run from the bullshit.
Right.
So I'm watching this thing. Okay. I thought he basically did a pretty decent job. He took a gajillion questions. He answered them in pretty much the same way that all press people do, which is, half answers.
Partially and move on to the next one.
And that's what they do. But suddenly I saw all the headlines. First off, the main Twitter moment headline was saying that he was focusing on the numbers of people there. That was just a small portion, and it was only because they kept asking him that
Right.
same question.
Right.
So that's also fake news, right? Where they just keep framing something a certain way, not just what is said, but that you can take an hour and a half thing and go, well, this was the part that was important, when it actually wasn't the part that was important.
Let me say a couple of things about that. Spicer not only quarreled with the idea that Trump's audience was larger than what the media reported, he also talked about the fact that a reporter from Time Magazine, not the Buck Tussle Gazette, Time Magazine, said that Donald Trump removed the bust of MLK from the Oval Office. Now that to me is a major story if it were true. It is not true. Time Magazine, a reporter for Time Magazine tweeted it, and it went around the world. Rather than focus on that fake news part, they talk about what Sean Spicer said about the crowd size, because that's something they could probably make an argument about.
Yeah.
But the MLK thing, they can't make an argument about that, so we haven't even talked about that.
Yeah.
And we found out because of WikiLeaks, David, how many of these reporters were in bed with the DNC, in bed with Hillary. I mean, a New York Times reporter is doing a massive story on Hillary and gave her veto proof over quotes she doesn't like. A power that she in fact used and took out a quote that she'd made about Sarah Palin.
Yeah. You're not making this up, by the way.
Washington Post was doing a story on John Podesta and found out some conflict of interest regarding money, and gave him a heads up and told him, don't worry about it, we'll bury it in the story. Staffers for Jake Tapper and for Wolf Blitzer of CNN contacted the DNC and said, we're about ready to interview some Republicans. Do you have any questions for us? Dana Milbank is a columnist with the Washington Post. He did a column called The 10 Most Outrageous Things Donald Trump Has Ever Said. He contacted the DNC and said, I'm about ready to do this column on the 10 most outrageous things Donald Trump ever said. Do you have any suggestions? They gave him 10 suggestions. He used 8.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
You didn't even mention the most egregious one, in my opinion, which is the whole Donna Brazile thing, which is, to me, the heart, because that one is the heart of how corrupt media and politicians have become.
But at least CNN fired her. But the DNC hired her as interim chair, even after she was outed as having conspired with Hillary to make sure that Bernie Sanders did not win.
So what does that say about the Democrats?
But I think one of the most outrageous ones is a guy named Kurt Eichenwald.
Yeah.
He writes for Newsweek and tweeted that Donald Trump had been put in a mental institution for some time. No evidence for it whatsoever. He took the tweet down pretty quickly when it was debunked, but he wasn't fired or even suspended or even chastised.
So this is where people talk about post-truth. Now, I know we don't want to be in a post-truth society.
What's post-truth?
But, well, post-truth, that at this point, any idiot who's amassed 150,000 Twitter followers has as much influence in a lot of respects as Newsweek.
I'm almost at 150,000.
Yeah.
Thank you for calling me an idiot.
I just went above it. That's why I mentioned that number, because I'm any idiot that could have as much influence. But really, you could have you could figure out how to do the social media game, and somehow, because of that, you got a little blue check too. Now you're an authority on this stuff. So that I do see as a major risk, that while I wanted the mainstream media to get the lashing it deserved, the fact that it's now everyone's just picking their truth wherever they can find it is a huge problem.
It's both a problem and a blessing. It also means that the traditional establishment media can be gone around. You can get your ideas out, and nothing can stop you from communicating to people. But you're right. It means that anybody can communicate, and whether or not he or she is credible is left to you as a consumer to figure out.
Is there any way that you think Trump can reconcile this relationship with the media? Because I think it's almost the most important thing right now, more important than the policies. Because it's one thing to just rail against the media all the time. Again, I don't like what the mainstream media has done. But do you think he can get to a point where he'll actually do some real sit-downs, do some real press conferences, and not do the same things? Be willing to sit down with an interviewer, hopefully it'll be me, but maybe it'll be somebody else, and not demand the questions in advance. Be better than all the reasons that you just said the Democrats.
Well, I don't think it's Donald Trump's job to curry favor with the media. I think it's the media's job to be fair. And as far as I'm concerned, he has very little risk. He is disliked more than Reagan, more than George W. Bush, in my opinion. They're out to get him. And for him to have a more confrontational attitude towards the media, to me, makes perfect sense, because there is no upside in him doing it any other way. They're going to go after him like nobody's business. Yeah. They dislike him because of his attitude about immigration. They think of him as a racist. They think of him as a bigot, as a tyrant. If that's your attitude, and you're not going to cut me any slack, why should I kiss your butt? And so I have no problem with what Sean did. Sean Spicer, his first informal press conference, when he blasted the media the way he did. And it does turn out that Donald Trump's audience, which is the word he used to watch the inaugural, was bigger than any audience in history, in part because of social media.
Right. So a lot of people on Twitter were angry with me over that because I didn't say anything about it. But if you listen to actually what he said audience, meaning and then he clarified it on Monday. He said, I mean people that are streaming it on Facebook and watching on iPads
and YouTube
and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But everybody wants everyone to get outraged all the time. It's exhausting, isn't it?
It also turns out, apparently, that when you look at the pictures of Obama's inaugural and Trump's does look thinner, but my understanding is part of that is because of security measures. There's certain places you can't stand anymore, certain places you can't go through anymore, so a lot of people couldn't get to the main area because of all these security requirements. So you're comparing not apples to apples. And so
but you'd agree all that is just sideshow nonsense, right? Like, it's actually completely irrelevant whether the amount of people I'm talking about, not the lying about it, but just whether there were X amount of people or Y, it's just irrelevant.
Completely irrelevant, except that he's putting media on notice, that you have to be fair to me.
Yeah. Do you think the media regrets, it's hard to categorize all the media, but when they look back at the way they treated McCain, who now looks like the most moderate Republican of all time, and they were times calling him racist, and I think he has an adopted black daughter, if I'm not mistaken. Or when they look at Romney and the binders of women and made it sound like he hates women, that they in a way, they created Trump, because any Republican was going to get the cries of racism, was going to get the cries of misogyny and the cries of xenophobia and homophobia and all that. So he brings up Peter Thiel, he still hates gays. He has Ben Carson, he still hates black people. So in a way, he was the only answer to this absurd equation.
I think you're right. I think the media did help to create Donald Trump. People resent the idea that the media has gone after Republicans in a way that they've not gone after Democrats. And so there's a distrust. And when Donald Trump talked about political correctness and how he was no longer going to be politically correct, a lot of people took that to mean I'm no longer going to think of myself as a racist, as a sexist, simply because I've got normal views and normal ideas that any other guy has. And I think Donald Trump has given people like that a certain amount of comfort and credibility.
Yeah. All right, so one more for you, which will sort of wrap this whole thing up. What happens over the next 4 years? Where do you really see this all going? Do you see this endless clash between Trump and the left? Is there a way to get the media straightened out? Can we get some of this societal stuff to shake out, or is it just going to be more battling? Because it seems, I thought there was going to be a couple days after the election where everyone would take a breath.
Right.
It seems like everyone's just ramping up more and more now.
No, people see things differently. We disagree. We disagree about abortion. We disagree about same-sex marriage. We disagree about taxes, about spending, about foreign policy. As long as we have those disagreements, we're going to have these kinds of disputes. But I think what will happen, hopefully, is that we have 4% GDP growth. Like we did under Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was overwhelmingly reelected, not because people agreed with him. They disagreed with him about his nuclear proliferation. They disagreed about his going into South America and trying to roll back some of the communist movements there. If you go down list by list, there was an article in the New York Times in 1986. It talked about all of these points of views and how Americans disagreed with Ronald Reagan, but they respected him and overwhelmingly reelected him because ultimately, it comes down to the economy, it comes down to pocketbook. And 70% of the American people felt that we were on the wrong track economically, and that is the primary reason, in my view, why Donald Trump won. Worst economic recovery since 1949. This has been a 2% recovery. The average recovery is 3%. And the difference between 2% and 3% is 1 million jobs times the length of the recovery. So if Obama had done nothing, had worked on his putting, we'd have 7 million more jobs than we have right now.
Yeah, well, he did work on the putting.
Yeah, we'd have 10 million more. Then.
There you go. All right, well, Larry, it was a pleasure. We're going to do a little bonus segment for our Patreon audience, and I thank you for coming back.
My pleasure.
And we're going to link to the original one, and people can see if maybe I changed you in some ways too. Who knows?
Well, I felt the same way leaving as I felt coming. How's that?
Fair enough. All right, for more on Larry, check out his website, larryelder.com.